All right, so I'm gonna breeze through this really quick. These videos only can last 15 minutes, so we might have to have a part one and part two, but here we go for Islamic land-based empires. Remember, if you have questions, you need to bring them to class. We're not gonna be able to cover everything, so this is me doing a favorable guest lecture here to get this done. Sorry the other recording didn't work. All right, let's skip through this stuff and get to the goods. All right. So here we have our pre-Islamic modern period empires. The big ones, Mughal, Ottoman, Safavid, and remember, we're also in this chapter covering Russia, China, Japan, and then we'll talk about Europe and the Reformation going on there. So there's generally two things going on. There's two options as you are an expanding empire. You can either do sea-based empires, which you develop a strong navy, you explore across the water, and then you establish colonies that you move into and transfer people to and suck commerce and goods out of. The other one is land-based empires, and they, instead of developing a navy, they go with a really strong army, and then they expand just territories, and they're not really developing colonies. They mostly just absorb people into their culture, kind of like we've seen with very traditional empires since we started this class. And they really like to isolate themselves from others. Like they're very closed off from other societies to some extent and do their own thing. So the ones we're going to look at today, though, are going to be the land-based, and they are typically, they're the Mughals, Safavid, and Ottomans, right? So you can read over this. Like I said, pause this as you need if you need to take notes, but you've had access to this PowerPoint the whole time. Land-based empires, just think of them as traditional empires. People have not had navies to go exploring across seas and oceans for very long, and we still haven't made it across the Atlantic until 1492, and even a little bit before that, we just have the Portuguese figuring out how to get from Europe into the Indian Ocean. So the sea-based stuff is all very, very new. The land-based is all very, very traditional. And this typical period is called the Age of Gunpowder Empires or Gunpowder Empires because people are now using guns. It is a technology that people kind of have. Some cultures are better at gun technology than others. Europe is very good at creating guns and cannons and muskets. So other people definitely want access to that technology. So things that these empires, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal have in common, they're all Islamic. They represent really the height of Islamic power and military prowess. We saw Dar al-Islam, and that was like a very large expanse of all these different Islamic empires that kind of collectively went under this name. But this is when they're really at their height. These individual empires are very strong. They were really kind of, I guess, not opposite, but the opposing force to Europe. Europe is trying to comb through the globe, especially after the Americas are discovered and they get into the Indian Ocean system. And you have these three empires just kind of doing their own thing. By 1750, all three are declining. Some hang on a little bit longer. For example, the Ottomans are going to hang on till after World War I, the very end of World War I. But they all kind of dwindle around the same time. They're not competing for colonizing territories in the Americas, even when that happens. They are doing their own thing. They're not interested in that. They don't typically have a navy, so that's not for them. So the Ottomans, a small Turkic warrior group, which we'll see with the Safavids as well. They're kind of cool because their empire lasted for 600 years with the same dynasty or family or whatever in charge. And they started combing through modern day Turkey and into Greece. Basically, they come in and they take over part of the Byzantine Empire. They start at Constantinople and then they kind of branch out from there until you have the picture on this map. Because they take over so many different types of places, they're very diverse, racially, ethnically, culturally, religiously, right? They have a little bit of everything in there. They become one of the most powerful empires of this time, along with Qing China and the Incas in the America. They're kind of top of the game initially. So Anatolia is where they're kind of based out of, with Constantinople being up here on the fringe. The person you got to know is probably Suleiman the Magnificent. He is the leader when this Ottoman Empire is at its height. Controls a lot of water traffic. The army he has is very strong and just keeps expanding. And the sultans are absolute rulers, right? They're in charge. They have a lot of other government officials, but it's not so much like three branches of government that all have to agree and have checks and balances. Suleiman the Magnificent, he's a sultan, so that means he is in charge. A commonality between all of these three land-based empires is going to be that they all have problems with secession. After the leader dies, who takes over next? Well, you have all these sons and they all want the power, so they often fight, which adds to some political instability off and on. Let's see. Here's them taking over Constantinople, and that was really when they got their claws into this region, and you start seeing the Byzantine Empire crumble and just become part of the Ottoman Empire for the most part. This chapter really likes to look at how females are treated and participating in society. Turkic women initially had a lot of rights, but as Islam was adopted and became the dominant religion, they went to the veiled, where like legit wear veils over their faces, and are more secluded from society, but it doesn't mean they don't have rights. It's both. They're not counted in the census as part of the population, so they don't count as a person on paper. But if you are a woman who is married to somebody that participates in the royal court, you do have influence, because you're kind of hobnobbing with all these elites, and you can talk to men and you can kind of have their ear and persuade them to do things. So they have a little bit of unofficial leverage. Women do have property rights. They could instigate divorce. They could have an inheritance. It didn't just go to their husband. And Roxolana is the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, and she is considered like a powerful woman. The Sultanate of women. Wives and mothers and sultans experienced power of the sultan and made decisions for the empire. A lot of this has to do with something called harem politics as well. Harem politics are in a harem where you have lots of women. The mother typically would get to pick, the mother of the leader would get to pick who participated in the harem and what kind of girls were allowed to be part of a sultan's harem. Therefore, she could bring in girls that exercised her kind of political agenda or her political beliefs. And then when the sultan would be hanging around mom and all these girls, they would kind of push him into certain directions, which would aid in getting him to make political decisions that they kind of had set forth and pushed. You can watch those videos on your own on the PowerPoint. The other thing is Janissaries and Deshurvme. So with this Deshurvme, which I'm probably saying it wrong, but I say it because that's how it's spelled, they would take Christian boys at a very young age in the empire, and they would become slaves of the sultan. So some of these children that were taken and trained, they'd be educated and trained, and they're all leading to joining a military career of some sorts. If they became kind of trained in the elite forces and were really good at what they did, they could go on to make up the Janissaries. That's kind of how it started. The Janissaries initially were made up of these Christian boys who were taken and forced to be military. And then eventually the Janissaries became this like super elite part of the military. They became the first standing army to ever exist in the world. So these are interrelated terms. Deshurvme is the process of training these boys, and it's the act of like taking these young boys, these Christian boys, and training them this way. The Janissaries are what some of them would turn into, and they would be the military army of the time. They used guns and heavy artillery, which matches your Gunpowder Empire business. And at this time, they have weapons that are up to date, and they are competing with people around, and they're doing a really good job, and they're taking over a lot of territory. I mention that because when we look down the road a ways, the Ottomans will later become infamous for not keeping up with the times and being stagnant and not developing like other places in the world. So at this time, they're still keeping up with everyone else in society and even powering ahead with their Janissaries and their weapons technology. So You have old aristocrats found themselves out of military power just as economic weakness greatly reduced incomes from their land. So you do have these old elites kind of falling to the wayside, and people that are holding positions in the military are now being granted land and money. Like being in the military is a way to make a life for yourself. It is a way to live a comfortable life. It's a good job. The Janissaries are super special. So here you go, picture of them using their muskets, cannons. They are kind of iconic with the strength of the Ottomans. You can read this to yourself, but it talks about the Janissaries as described by others who kind of ran into them and what they're dressed like and what they do. Economic challenges that this group faced. Istanbul is the capital, so this used to be Constantinople, but when they took over, they changed the name to Istanbul, so it's the same place on a map. It's still the center of the city. It's where pretty much all the wealth is, and it's a primary trade route, and that's what made Constantinople so good, right? It's kind of this linking point between two continents, basically, and you also have waterways to go there. So primary seaports, bazaars, which are like they're like giant markets. Like think of a farmer's market, but like bigger. Or if you've seen the cartoon Aladdin, when he's going through the marketplace, like stealing fruit and people are selling jewels and cloth, like that's a bazaar. By the mid 17th century, we start seeing them like time out. Like this is as far as they get. This is all they're going to get. And they start really just kind of declining, not horribly, just like they get stagnant. Stagnant is a word I guess I prefer. Things stop progressing forward, and if you're not moving forward, you're declining, right? You have to keep growing, you have to keep doing well. They're not. The empire is just too big, and even though the sultan's in charge, you have all these other people that are around doing their government jobs, but they're also really corrupt. And people are getting positions they don't deserve. They're potentially stealing money. It just becomes unstable in that regard. And then you also have high taxes for peasants because they have to fuel their military expansion, pay all their bureaucrats. It's a large empire. And just like we've seen iconically in history, if you overtax your peasants, they freak out and they revolt. So then you have to deal with that, and that's another whole instability issue. You also have secession issues. Sons of sultans held as hostages to prevent coups. There was this idea where if you held them hostage, you could prevent an overhaul, like a war from starting. So that's something else you shouldn't have to deal with. When we look to Europe, there's a very strict rule on how secession works. Like, right, the oldest son of the king, that's who becomes it, and that's it. If you are not the first son, like, too bad, so sad, you're not getting it. The Ottoman Empire doesn't follow that rule. You also have the Janissaries starting to demand more. They want political power, but they also want to be paid more because they know they're such an iconic, important piece of this empire that probably couldn't exist without them and wouldn't be as big without them. So they get kind of snobby and demand more. You also have the idea of inflation, which I talked about in class, but when silver is discovered in the New World in the Americas, it changes the game. Silver has been a coveted thing. That's price is soaring because it's so rare and China has hoarded it all. But then the Europeans discover it in America, flood the markets, and so the cost, the value of silver just tanks. It goes way down. They also have trouble with their economic system because the Sultan follows this very strict, like legally fixed rate on taxes instead of being able to change as needed. And so when silver declines, you don't have taxes lessen, and they should because now money is worth less. They stay the same, so people have to just pay more and more and more silver because it's not as profitable to own silver at this point. It's worth so much less. And they were at a disadvantage. Religious law kept them from being able to reform tax laws. There were certain things in place that kept them out of competing on the world market, and it just made things really rough. So you can read this about tax farming. And then you do have the idea of just the culture and the religion being a little different. Majority is Sunni Muslim. I believe they're the ones that start out as Shia, but then are formally changed to Sunni, and my display is going to end, so we're going to have to pause it here.